All right, welcome back to our next episode of You're Such a Great Listener. This session will be a book talk as well. So last time we had talked about, I have it right here, bad therapy. But this time we are going to talk about The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. The first thing I think we can say, which we were just talking about, is unlike Abigail Schreier, Jonathan Haidt actually is a professor. He is a social psychologist. He has a PhD. He teaches in the NYU School of Business currently. And so he's not writing a book about his feelings, even though I think he intersperses his feelings in here a lot. But he brings a lot of data, and it seems to be a bit more objective, I think, than the previous book that we read. We both walked away from that book thinking, okay, what if she found data that didn't match with what she was trying to say? And his basic argument is that two major things have happened that have caused childhood and adolescence to be severely different. The first is that children have less autonomy and independence and can take less risks in the real world, in the physical world. And the second is that they kind of have complete autonomy in the online world. And they spend a tremendous amount of time there. And the combination of those two factors has led children to have increasing rates of mental illness. Sound about right?
Yeah, I really like how you kind of framed these two different pieces of the book, the screen child and the play child, and how at one time I hear my child. Sorry, you hear my child
No.
because they're playing. There's a
Yes.
bounce house outside, and there is childcare, and I am working from home on technology, and I guess this is work-life balance.
Yeah.
But how do we make time for play, and how do we schedule play, and how do schools support play, and how does society encourage parents and children to be able to play? And that's juxtaposed to all the research, I think, the data that he brings in about the difference between the Gen Z generation, what he calls born after 1995, and everyone that came before it. And he does compare anxiety levels, depression levels, suicidality levels, self-harm levels of this Gen Z plus generation. He kind of says it's the generation that doesn't end because, after the 1995 babies, the kids were coming to age, they were reaching puberty online, right? And how did they compare? How do they compare to those of us who were raised before screens, before, you could give your kid an iPad or a telephone, right? I mean, kids were learning how to scroll in 2008. Well, grown-ups were still like pretending they were on their Blackberries, right? So, how do we kind of look at these two um, different pieces of the puzzle that fits together with what we think as parents and mental health professionals think about as this generation with a lot of challenges?
Yeah. One of the things that he addresses is really the social norms have entirely changed. And so it's really hard to be on an island trying to say to your child, you can't have a device yet. You should be spending less time on a device when, then you go to all the effort, you arrange a play date and you find out that your kids were
Yes.
playing the
Oh my
same
gosh.
video
Right.
game in their play date or watching the same YouTube video you were trying to get your kid not to watch, and that's
Right.
why you arranged for the play date. And that, social norms are really such that it's really hard now to be the parent who says, I don't want my child on a device.
Yes.
I want my child outside. I want my child playing.
Right.
And it takes an intense amount of parenting effort because
Right.
it seems like it's just you doing it on your own.
Right. And I really appreciate though how the book was split up to address the different pieces of this challenge. That establish like he in the first part of the book he really establishes the issue of screen time being introduced to kids without the research to document what that means, and then a whole piece on what we're seeing between the Gen Z versus the millennials and everyone that came before. And then there's that last part of the book that really talks about what we can do as a society. And I think that's kind of where you're bringing this in, of what parents can do, what schools can do, what government can do, what tech can do to really, I don't want to say ameliorate, but from his perspective, really slow down tech use with kids, to say that, we can see data that increased tech use can, there's some sort of correlation, whether we want to say it's causation or correlation or coincidental. But when kids are on tablets during the formative years of puberty, or telephones during the formative years of puberty, they're not sleeping as well. They're not playing as much, right? They're not engaging in the play that you're describing on the play dates. And that the quality of their lives, and I love how he goes through like these 4 areas of deprivation, and really like kind of distills things down very, very carefully. And then doesn't stop there, which I think some books stop at. He then offers some really helpful solutions, and those solutions from, I'm a social worker, we think about the biopsychosocial spiritual assessment. He kind of goes through that. He's saying, some of the recommendations you were talking about, working on a play date, but I really loved his recommendations. I was like, okay, like this is practical. And the piece at the end of every chapter, which is like a summary of the whole chapter. If you don't want to read the chapter, you can just read like the cliff notes at the end, were really like, they were thought provoking, like things that I want to do as a parent, but I don't necessarily have the guts to do without like saying to my kids, like, here, the book says this is what I should be doing.
So I'll tell you, I go back and forth. I do some of the things, then I don't do some of the things.
I
We're
know.
all
He
human.
talks about routine. Like, it's so hard. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it takes
But
time and money, and like that whole piece of privilege. Like some of the recommendations, giving your kid a screen for childcare is accessible and it's affordable, and sometimes it gets the job done.
yeah, I have to say we're recording this in the week in between camp and school
Yes.
here in the New York area, and my kids are all old enough that they're in full-time school, and so I don't have extra childcare this week, and
Right.
screens are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for me right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's kind of, especially because we can't let our children roam free. Right. I think that our parents were like kicked out in the morning, told to come back when the lights turn on in the street, and that was it. And
I
we
have
can't do
memories in
that.
6th grade riding my bike, not to the close library, the far library during the summer, and hanging out there, and then eventually coming back home during these weeks between camp and school.
Yeah.
I was definitely too young, I guess. I don't know. I don't. And
Too young by today's standards.
right,
But
too
what I
young
was
by.
kind of going to say before is, right, I years ago, let my 2 older sons go biking around the neighborhood by themselves. The eldest one was already in middle school, so he did have a cell phone in case of emergency. And they had a great time until they got into some sort of sibling squabble. And so they came home kind of whatever. But by the next day, they were super excited about this adventure that they'd had. And so, one of the younger one was seeing a therapist for a short bit. And so she asked him, how was your weekend? And he tells her this whole story of what he had done. And she looked at me and she said, you let him do this? And I was like, yeah, I let him ride his bike around my neighborhood. And she was kind of like, by himself? He was with his brother alone. And I was, and the look that she gave me made me feel like if I were maybe a different person, if she didn't know me better, maybe she's going to call CPS when I walk out. Like that was the look I was getting from her. And I kind of had to do like a real gut check. Like, did I do something wrong by letting out my middle schooler and the next one for a couple hours for independent play?
Right.
And they came home so triumphant. And I was kind of like, I don't think it's me. I think it's
Right.
her. I don't
And
think it's me.
society. And that's
Yeah.
why I love this book, because he in the last bit there's explicit recommendations for government, for tech, for schools, and for parents. And it really starts with a culture, and you're kind of penalizing free play,
Mhm.
of saying to our kids, we can't let them take risks and fail as kids in normal stuff because we're helicoptering them, right?
Yeah.
And that this play from an attachment perspective is really, really important because it teaches them life skills, it teaches them social skills, it teaches them how to fall down and get back up, how to have a fight with their brother when they're off on their bike, and make up and come back and be able to tell a story. And that's really super powerful. I almost felt like after reading this book, I was being given permission by a professor, by a social psychologist, that, you know what, if my kid wants to walk around the block, like, that's okay. Like,
Yeah.
this is like what kids were supposed to be doing. They were not meant to be at home on their screens all hours of the day. And
Well, or the alternative is supervised by their parents, right?
yeah,
Why
yeah,
are we indulging, on some level, why are we indulging in so much screen time? Because the alternative is that we have to be fully present with our children at all times.
right,
And that was never childhood either. Like you
right.
said, you rode the bike to the far library and
Far
you
life.
kind of made it
It was
home at
far
some
away. Yeah.
point.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and I think
that,
that's what bad therapy was also kind of alluding to, like, and that, and with all the criticism, the something that did give me food for that was really the fact that, latchkey kids figured out how to take care of themselves, and again, I'm not suggesting that at all, but I think there's something to be said about Haight's approach of letting kids take risks. That if you're giving your kids a secure base, and he talks about it from an attachment perspectives and brings in Bowlby, who's and so really entrenches this in the literature. But if we are thinking about this as mental health professionals, if we're good enough parents, and
mhm,
that's a term that
yes.
Donald Winnicott, also another object relations theorist, this one from Britain, coined, is if we can be good enough parents and our kids have a secure attachment and they know if they're out on their bike and something bad happens, that they can rush home or rush into a house and say what happens, we're teaching them life skills, and we're doing it in an age appropriate way. And I loved how he set out age appropriate developmental milestones for
Mm,
responsibilities as well as tech responsibilities, and that there
yeah.
were really clear recommendations. So, in the book, there's clear guidelines that he feels governments should take in terms of, you know, like you said, like allowing kids to take more risks and parents not to be penalized if they allow their kids to take those risks. Having more play spaces, having more safer play spaces, really incentivizing play, and at the same time making sure that kids aren't having access to technology that they shouldn't be, like limiting screen, having warnings. And that also takes buy-in from the tech industry, um,
Yeah,
which,
for
is
sure.
kind of that industrial psychology piece of all this. Of we now know what we didn't know in 2008, that this stuff is addictive.
Yeah. One thing he also talks about that I want to highlight, because I know I do this when I work with moms all the time, but he talks about how, building resilience is through messing up,
Yes.
right? Not
Yeah.
the kind of, risk where you're going to die, right? But the kind of risk where like you end up with a bruise, right? These things teach children what they can do, what they can't do. And I think that a lot of parenting now is focused on making sure my kid is happy in the moment, making sure that my kid is comfortable in the moment. And there isn't a lot of long range thinking about what that means. And that if my child never confronts anything challenging, then my child will not know how to navigate challenges.
Yeah.
And so it is okay as a parent to watch your child have a meltdown in their social circle and
Mhm.
help them, figure out what to do next, but not go in and manage it, right?
Right.
Not call the other mom and be like, your kid said X to my kid, you need to punish them, right? But rather to say to your kid, how do you want to advocate for yourself in this situation? How
Right.
do you think you should best handle it? I'm going to help you instead of I'm going to fix it for you. I'm going to support you as you figure out how to fix this problem for yourself, right? So both like in the playground, needing to be able to, you know, climb on something risky and fall down, and
Right,
also
right,
socially being able to learn how in the teen years to kind of navigate these complex social interactions.
right,
And I think a lot of parents have this, I need to fix it. My kid needs to be happy. If they go to sleep upset one day, it's going to be horrible. As opposed to real life, which
right,
is so challenging,
right,
and we can do it, right? As
right.
confident adults,
Yeah,
we can
yeah,
navigate these challenges. We know we're
right,
not going to go to sleep every night and everything's going to feel great in the world,
right,
but we still know that we're on a trajectory towards living our better life,
right.
and we can handle that.
So I appreciated also in Anxious Generation how for the piece on parents, there's concrete tools to be able to do this or
Yeah.
concrete suggestions. Um, and without giving the whole book away, I think that some of the suggestions really resonated, that the more time that kids are on screen, the less time they're doing the play stuff, right? The less time they're having with face-to-face play, having quality sleep, reading, um, cooking, playing in the mud. One of my kids likes to collect rocks, and his rock collection. I'm sure if there was a screen in front of him, he's not going to be playing with his gems. But
Hmm.
when there's no screen around and you're in the backyard, that you can find pebbles, but they're gems, and that's the beginning of
Right.
play. And when we're on screen, we're not necessarily playing, and it's just it's a time management thing. um and he also then talks about how to use the screen then responsibly. How do we set limits? How do we identify if those limits are just like too hard to follow, right? And that's, I think, kind of playing on also what you're discussing in terms of being able to check in with your kids and like have open, honest dialogue. Is there addiction? Is there difficulty? We know that guys are online a lot more gaming, right?
Hmm.
He talks about pornography in the book,
Hmm.
um, you know, simulated life instead of real life.
Yes.
And that can be extremely addictive. Like, industrial psychologists are working to make this technology addictive, the ads addictive. And how do we
Hmm.
have real conversations with our girls about body image, about eating disorders, about social issues that come up like bullying? And again, I think some of the gender distinctions that were laid out in the book might be um, become less significant over time. I don't know if you were also thinking that at all, but like, men are also developing eating disorders from the images. Um, Women are also now gaming a lot more and can and there's more and more games directed towards women. So it's just really interesting to think about, and how do we have these conversations with our kids around responsible technology use, setting limits, getting quality sleep, that they have to also make really smart decisions, and that we're training them from an early age to have responsibilities, make smart decisions. It's not only how much you're watching, but also what you're watching.
Yeah, one of the lovely things that has come out of this book is an increased conversation in a
Yes.
lot of communities, a lot of schools, a lot of
Yeah.
school districts, about how we are engaging around technology use. I know, like, one of his recommendations is that, like, schools should say you have to hand your phone in at the beginning of the day. And
Yeah, that
having
like
had
that
kids who went
phone-free
to a school
schools.
like that,
Yeah,
they had fake phones. They had the phone they gave into the school and the phone they had in their pocket. So we have to think a little more robustly in some regards. But
right.
the idea is
And I
that
think we have
this
to think
is
about parent buy-in, right? Like, who's
yes,
buying them the phones? Like, yes, there's going to
right.
be kids that will find it whether or not their parents give it to them or not. But if in these
But this is a
situations,
great conversation starter. If this is
yeah,
something that you want to bring to your community, I have to say it's a long book. It's a little bit dense. Like you said, it does have the chapter summaries, but he also has really great interviews online, really
yes.
great podcasts that he's joined. I think you mentioned Wall Street Journal is one of
Yeah, the,
them.
the Wall Street Journal interview presentation is on YouTube, and like
Yeah, but
I
you
think it's like
can you
a
can
half an
find
hour.
him
It's a great reference piece. Yeah.
you can find him talking about what he's passionate about in a lot of different places, and you can use that to jumpstart a conversation in your own community. Because as you're saying, Rachel, it needs to be something that has both parent buy-in and institutional buy-in. I don't think, can control whether or not the tech industry has buy-in and whether they begin to regulate this. He makes an analogy to kind of seatbelts, right? And how, like,
Right.
why would we ever govern that? And then we did, and then children were more safe, right? And so it
Right.
kind of feels like the same thing needs to happen here.
Right.
That we begin to govern it, and then we realize how much safer kids are, and then we're like, yeah, we need that. But I don't think we as individuals can control that, but I think we can
Yeah.
have much more control in terms of our own community, in terms of our children's own schools. I know that I gave my kids phones way earlier than I wanted to because all of their friends had phones. That started to be how they were planning to meet up in person. So now my kids were being excluded from the in-person meetups I wanted them to have because they didn't have the tech,
Right.
right?
Right.
Whereas
Well, now
now,
that, this book and other mental health professionals are really supporting a wait until eighth movement, meaning
correct.
it's not just one parent, it's collectively parents deciding we are going to wait until high school to give our kids smartphones, which you didn't have that support
So
around.
the wait until 8 existed, and I wanted to wait
But it
until
didn't have a
8,
critical
but there
mass. It
was no
needs a
community
critical
behind
mass.
it. But now
Yeah.
there's a massive conversation about it. And so if this is something you think that your community or your kids would benefit from, I really want to encourage you, either read the book, watch one of his podcasts, watch one of his interviews, and take it to your friends, take it to your school administration, and say, this is what our children need, right? They need more play, risky play.
Yeah.
They need more play,
Yeah.
and they need less tech, social tech, right? You
Yeah.
can have ed tech, but we don't need social tech, right?
And
And
having
I
those
think,
discussions you're saying around responsible tech usage is like, it's almost like a
yeah,
harm reduction model. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I think that's kind of my takeaway. This is a great moment.
Yes.
If you want this to bring this to your community, this is a great moment that you can do that. Um, and I think people should really be taking advantage of the fact that this is like on the top of everybody's reading list to really make some inroads for the mental health and safety of our children.
Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we work with young adults. We work with the Gen Zs who were raised on tech. I work with a lot of neurodivergent individuals who struggle with executive functioning, and the research coming out on gaming and social media during puberty impacting the prefrontal cortex and the part of your brain that like works on executive functioning makes me hopeful. It makes me hopeful that with this conversation, with these concrete recommendations for government, for tech, for schools, for communities, for parents, that we can go from a much more macro conversation to also these small conversations like the one we're having, and the one that I had honestly with my kids and my husband after reading the book, that like, what kind of changes are we going to make in our home so that we are using technology not only more responsibly but more intentionally.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, I think we can put this all on our kids, but as parents so often do, we like to project our problems onto our kids. I am always trying to be more mindful about my own usage. My
Yeah.
kids are modeling what I do,
Yeah.
right? I am sitting there and scrolling while I'm eating, and then I'm telling them, we're not on devices when we eat. It makes us less mindful about our food intake. We don't realize
That's
when we're
really
full, but they see that when I eat, I'm doing the same thing, right? So I think that he doesn't talk about it directly, but
Yeah,
I
that's like
think
the
that that's
2.0
something.
book. That's the next one. What do we do with the grown-ups that were what do we do with the millennials that were introduced to technology as a coping?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Like we need to, I think, ramp it back for ourselves also and just take that time to be like, what are the other things I could be doing with my life? Or is this, if I want my kid to act this way, then I need to model that behavior as well.
amazing, amazing,
So,
Orly. This was a great
yeah,
talk. Thank you. It was
yes,
nice
I
to
think so too.
process it and kind of think about it with you, and hopefully this will be helpful for others as well. So,
Yeah, awesome. Have a great day. And thank you for joining us on You're Such a Great Listener.
see you next month.